Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I am here with the wonderful Téa Obreht. I am so excited to have her here to talk about this fantastic book called The Morningside, her third novel. We're going to get to all of that in just a jiff, but first, welcome, welcome, welcome. The Thoughtful Bro is here every Tuesday at 2 on Facebook, YouTube, and X, streaming over the airways of A Mighty Blaze. We talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. And if you don't know about A Mighty Blaze, we are an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually. We started right in the heart of COVID about 4 years ago. At A Mighty Blaze, we're never asking for money. If you want to show the love or tell your friends about us, that would be just amazing. Just like us and follow us on social media. If you are in the mood to spend money, please spend it on fabulous genre-bending works of literary fiction by National Book Award finalists that mix the speculative and the mythic like only Téa Obreht can. Books like The Morningside. Go ahead, open up a browser tab, and look at that beautiful cover. Buy a few copies for yourself and your friends. We'll put a link to buy it in the chat. Regarding questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. They'll make their way to me, and we'll ask Téa anything you want at the end of the interview. A little bit more about Téa before we get started. She was born in Belgrade in the former Yugoslavia. She grew up in Cyprus and Egypt before eventually immigrating to the United States. Her debut novel, The Tiger's Wife, won the 2011 Women's Prize for Fiction, formerly called the Orange Prize for Fiction. It was a 2011 National Book Award finalist and went on to become an international bestseller. Her work has been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories and the Best American Non-Required Reading, and has appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, The Atlantic, Vogue, and Esquire. She was a recipient of the 2016 Fellowship for the National Endowment for the Arts. She was a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree and was named by The New Yorker as one of the 20 best American fiction writers under 40. Oh my God, Téa, I'm like, for those just listening, I'm doing the I bow down to you in praise motion here. My goodness. From 2020 to 2022, she was the endowed chair of creative writing at Texas State University in San Marcos. And at the end of the interview, we're going to talk a little bit about how she teaches creative writing. So for those writers who listen to the show, and I know there's lots of you, please check that out. She currently lives in Wyoming, and the great Ron Charles, writing about Morningside, said in the Washington Post that it is a surreal mix of Gotham and M.C. Escher. And People magazine said it was, quote, a touching, inventive novel about belonging and loss. Téa Obreht, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here, and I know you're on vacation. I won't say where because respecting your privacy, but she's in a very, very exciting place, and she carved out a little time for us. So thank you. Téa, this book, I felt Emily St. John Mandel, and I felt it because it's, set in the near future. It's kind of post-apocalyptic dystopian, yet it is not so focused on the darkness. It's more, there's a kind of curiosity in it. There's a kind of mysterious exploratory quality to it. It's not focused on like the grungy violence and grossness that you see in some dystopian stuff. So I just kind of, it was a little bit more, for that reason, a little bit more artful and literary, like something you'd see in Emily St. John Mandel. I felt Tess Gunty's Rabbit Hutch because it's kind of exploring a bunch of people who live in one building. And then there's, of course, this like dark fairy tale layer, which is pure Téa Obreht. Okay, that's how I always try to position the book for people. But why don't you just like tell us, do you see those comps? And also kind of in your words, tell us what the book is about.
I love that. And I love those comps. Thank you for them. I think it's so funny how um how in the swirl of everyday life and the impressions that are pressing in on us from everywhere, these similarities emerge in people's work, even though they don't have much other overlap. Do you know what I mean? I think Emily St. John Mandel, first of all, to write into dystopia after Station 11, I think it's a dangerous game because that book was so perfect, And if you'd told me that after my second book, I would venture into the future in my work, I would have been pretty skeptical about it. It took me by surprise. I had been living in New York for a really long time. I had wanted to write about it, but felt sort of various misgivings, chiefly that, great New York novels come from true great New York writers, and I never felt like one. I felt like an intruder in this place, which I think is often the plight of the immigrant. And I the pandemic happened. We moved to Wyoming full time. We had been splitting time, and I had been thinking about these sort of three things. This building that had gone up next door to us, that was part of the Jewish seminary complex on our street, and they had sold one of their parking lots, or no, they had sold a part of their parking lot and library to this developer, and they built this massive, massive, massive tower over many, many years, and everyone in the neighborhood hated it, but I found it this sort of fascinating monument to a kind of capitalistic like just determined capitalistic impulse, this feeling of like, no, we're going to build this. And then fittingly enough, it was completed in like March or April of 2020. I mean, it was perfect. Everything about it was just perfect, and much of it still sits very empty. So there was that, and then there were some images from our neighborhood that I had been thinking about a lot in terms of narrative. This woman that I had seen walking three Rottweilers on a chain one sunset while we were walking down the street. And when I left, I realized that these things somehow went hand in hand with each other, and with the story of the Vila, who is a Slavic mythic entity that I had really wanted to write about, and they ended up in the book. They joined forces in the book, and the book is about Sil. She's a climate refugee from a place called Back Home. She arrives in Island City with her mother, and Island City is a kind of a waterlogged metropolis, formerly great, now half submerged, and vastly depopulated. And the two of them are part of something called the Federal Repopulation Program, which puts climate refugees from other countries into spaces in whatever country this is, that have been most severely affected by climate change. And Sil and her mom move into a luxury tower, or a formerly luxury tower, called the Morningside, where her aunt is superintendent. And unlike Sil's mom, her aunt Enna is actually really willing to talk about the past, really willing to expound on family lore, on myths and legends of the area, and she gives Sil her first glimpse of her heritage. And through this prism, Sil comes to see the world differently and becomes obsessed with an upstairs neighbor who lives in the penthouse with three massive hounds, whom Sil starts to suspect are probably way more than they appear. It was a
My
long summary.
goodness. Yeah. Well, I have a friend that says like great books come about when two or three great ideas smash together. And that seems like what happened here.
I love that. Yeah, and it's sort of it's a weird one to talk about in interviews, because I feel like it's like, well, because often the first the first question, one of the first questions is like, how did this come about? And I wish there were a simpler, easier way than like, here's my whole biography, and also over the last several years, I was thinking about all these different things, and here they are in the book.
So I do want to get into actually a little bit about your method. I think it's really interesting how particularly this book came about, and I've been thinking a lot about that story you just told because I've heard you describe it in a few other places. So we'll dig into that for a second, but kind of on a more superficial level, this book came about sort of for a different reason, which is that the New York Times had this thing called the Decameron Project. And that, for people who might not know, is this, during the pandemic, the New York Times solicited short fiction from a number of incredible artists. I mean, the people who submitted stuff were Margaret Atwood, Charles Yu, Tommy Orange, David Mitchell, Victor Laval, Edwidge Dandicut, and the list sort of goes on, and it's at that caliber the whole way through. And so all these authors kind of wrote stories sort of about and inspired by the pandemic. And so you got approached and they said, hey, what do you got? I mean, like, had you already been working on this, or just when the New York Times called, you're like, okay, I'll come up with something?
I had been thinking about it, and it had sort of been kind of in the on the back burner in a kind of swirly way. I had written a couple of scenes and paragraphs and like little sketches, and they came around and they were like, "Do would you like to participate in this project?" And when they gave me the rundown of who else was, I mean, I was like, "Absolutely, I will write anything for this." Like, to be part of, a huge honor and very exciting. And then I thought, well, let me see if, and I think this is something that I've done before with some of my work. I find it a very useful exercise. I was like, let me see if these ideas can be contained only by a short story. At least that way there will be a kind of totality on the page. Like there'll be a beginning, middle, and end. I'll sort of see the shape of it, and by forcing it into this very small space, I think the limit was something like 1,500 words. Um, by forcing it into this very small space, I will see what else emerges. And the first thing that emerged was this mother-daughter relationship, right? Like the first thing I wrote in the short story continues to be the opening of book one of the novel, which is Anna's book, and that's the arrival of Syl and her mom at the Morningside. Um, so what I saw was this image of a woman and her daughter walking sort of hand in hand up a dark street, and there's a tide, and the building is, you know, clearly half abandoned, and I was like, what is all this? And very very quickly it became apparent that the short story could not hold all the questions that were kind of bursting out of these characters and these scenes. And I find that to be a very useful litmus test for what something wants to be. Now, whether it'll get to the end or not, you know, that's a different story. But
So I have friends who write short fiction and novels, and some of them approach short fiction sort of as a laboratory for a novel, right? They're like, let's see if I can make this voice work, if I can make this character work at 10 pages, right?
yeah,
And if it does, and they have this kind of exploding at the seams feeling that you just described, then they say, okay, maybe this can work as a novel. I'm just curious, like, how do you know if something has the juice to be a novel? Have you tried other short stories to expand into novels, or is it just sort of about this very kind of explosive feeling that you have?
I think it's about that explosive feeling, and it's also I wonder sometimes. Um, The Tiger's Wife started as a short story that I thought was a short story, but it was the first time I had attempted a true novel. And so I didn't know any better, you know. I started as a short story. It was a terrible short story, and then it turned out that the more of it I wrote, the better it got. Like that expansion allowed it to sort of it allowed the narrative voice to go into kind of these crevices of it that were actually the most interesting parts. And because it was my first time through a novel, that's how I learned what for me represented the difference between a short story and a novel at the outset of the project. But these days, I feel like it goes the other way. I feel like for me, it is a laboratory of you know, different kinds of attempts for what might work in a novel. But I feel like for me, I often think that something is a novel and I force it into a short story to see if I'm wrong, you know, like to see if it will actually like if
I
I can
love that. I love
contain
that.
it. Because so often and it actually has turned out to be very useful in a couple of incidents because my initial impulse to think of it as a novel is wrong and it actually is a short story, right?
Mm.
So yeah, that's my first attempt, kind of like close the suitcase, try to close a suitcase with like too much pain. It's like I bet I can get the zipper closed, and it's like no, you cannot, sorry.
I, the,
Cartoon.
the the analogy that came to my mind was like you're thinking somebody like might make a great long-term partner for you, but you're like, no, I'm just going to try to have a one-night stand and walk away. And if I can walk
Exactly.
away and not answer
Exactly.
the phone, then it's then I can walk
Perfect.
away.
It was what it was meant, magical for what it is.
All right, so that is really interesting. I didn't know that about Tiger's Wife being a short story first. Was Inland also short story first, or novel all
No.
the way?
Inland was it was a novel all the way. And I think that the size of it, because it was based on real events, and because what fascinated me about those real events was the coming together of these two narrative strands at what felt like the natural endpoint of the story. I knew that there was going to have to be a great deal of material and actually like a great deal of time covered and a great deal of emotional development within that time that could not possibly be a short story. So
Hmm.
that was like a true novel for me, like start to finish.
Got it. All right, so I want to go back to this idea of like the image, the Morningside, on your street in New York, and then the Slavic folklore and the woman with the dogs. And I just think it's really interesting where seminal ideas come from for novels and short stories and great works of art of any kind. And I was recently listening to a masterclass. You know that program,
Oh yeah.
masterclass.com? Yeah, yeah. So David Lynch did one, the director of Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks, kind of surrealist master of cinema. And he had two incredible analogies for how ideas turn into fully fledged works of art. And so I want to read each one to you, and then we'll stop after each one and then kind of like get your response. So this is quoting from David Lynch. I go where the ideas lead me. There are millions and millions of ideas out there, and we fall in love with an idea for some reason we do not understand. A desire for an idea is like a fisherman who puts bait on a hook. You don't know when the idea will come, but lo and behold, one lucky day, you catch an idea. Then you fall in love with this little fish you caught. Then you lower that fish back in, and the other fish that were in its school swim to it and are attracted to it. And then you catch more and more fish, and eventually a script starts to emerge. So, what do you think about that?
I love that. That feels really true. I love that. It's what a fun nautical analogy. It's just I love that. That feels. I love the acknowledgement that your attraction to it and its sort of attraction to you is a mystery. Um, and then that the fish that are actually attached to it, which are presumably swimming around in the waters of your subconscious, uh, join it at the surface. Right? That it reveals yourself to you in a way. Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. And it's like they're looking for their lost fish and they want to all stay together. I've always thought that a sea and fishing is such a striking metaphor for the unconscious. And like there's just so much mysterious, dark, deep, strange, powerful stuff way down deep, invisible
Yeah,
to you. And
yeah.
only the fisherman as an artist brings it up. I mean, I've always felt that. And I've always thought that The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway is sort of, this great parable. I'm not the one to first think of this, but this great
Yeah.
parable for the artist's life. And that he was at a point in his life where he didn't know if he was running out of stories. And then this old man goes out and pulls up the greatest story of his life. And then when he's coming back, the critics, i.e. the sharks, just tear it apart, and then he's
Yeah.
left with nothing. Anyway, that just as kind of a parable about the artist's life, I thought that's another one that uses that sea as the unconscious thing.
For sure, very fitting, very fitting. Yeah, absolutely. Critics as the sharks are possibly, the critique that you've learned to give yourself. The you tear yourself apart you have this perfect thing. It feels like the Anne Patchett's analogy, metaphor of the butterfly, like with your own hand, you crush it. Do you know that one?
No.
Anne Patchett has this. I'm paraphrasing it here, and I'm gonna butcher it, but she has this brilliant um, essay on writing, and part of it is this analogy of the butterfly, and it's you think of the book for a really really long time, for many many years, and it's this beautiful beautiful butterfly that exists, and it sort of exists in the room with you, and you see it, it's this perfect perfect thing, and then when the time comes to write it, you take it, and the quote is, and with my own hand I crush it, I put it on the
Oof.
page, and with my own hand I destroy this thing I love that would be perfect were it not for my having to seize and manipulate it into this thing for other people to join me in appreciation of. It's,
Oh my
it's
God.
the fish. I mean, like, I feel like that also is what happens to the old man's fish, right? This notion of, and then I caught it, right? Like I went out with this dream of this perfect catch, this perfect story. I caught it, and then in the act of catching it, I subjected it uh, to destruction, like inherently,
You're
in
wait,
the act of
wait.
catching it.
You're like blowing my mind right now, Taya. I mean, so wait, so I'm like totally looking at this in a different way now. So in your way, I think is much better than my way, because I was thinking like the critics, like externally, critics like writing for a newspaper are the ones that are destroying it, but that doesn't even fit with
Well,
the
and they do
metaphor.
too.
Well, they do too, right? Maybe that's like the fish processing factory is like where
Yes.
they cut up, right? But the sharks, to stick with the metaphor, the sharks in Hemingway's ocean are part of the actual subconscious. They're like part of the person and the mind and soul that created the work. And it's so interesting what you're saying, that like in the way you're explaining it to me, as I understand it, is like drawing the fish from the ocean is like this perfect, beautiful thing. But then in the act of translating this inspiration, which is so beautiful and perfect, into a work of art that another person can consume, that is like sort of a destructive act.
Yeah. That your engagement with it is inherently destructive of this perfect relationship you have with it before you actually begin to work on it, right?
God, I just got the chills. That is like, oh my God. I sort of like want to stop the interview and like go think about that for like an hour. That's so interesting. Okay. But moving on, we're going to do one more metaphor from
Okay.
David Lynch. And this one I actually liked more than the first one.
Mhm.
So he says, another analogy is that someone has a completed puzzle and they're sitting in the next room from you. And one by one, they toss little puzzle pieces through the door at me. And as more and more puzzle pieces come, I start to see something emerge until finally I have a completed puzzle.
Wow.
And that is like a relationship with like the muse was just, I thought, a beautiful thing. And also, again, reminded me about kind of the way that you were working with sort of images and instincts at the beginning.
Yeah, it's and both sort of both center on this idea of that there is a whole, right? There is a whole puzzle, there is a whole school of fish, and you are supposed to gather them, and that is your job to sort of make coherent sense out of this chaos of fish and puzzle pieces. Yeah, I love both of those. I hadn't heard them before. I'm watching the wrong master classes. I mean, not the wrong ones for me. He's just the wrong ones for this particular kind of engagement with the process. That's fascinating. I like that one a lot. I think it. I think the fish and fisherman one feels more viscerally true for me as a process, but the puzzle one, I like it a lot too.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm.
yeah,
Yeah, we're just that kind of, you can't see it all at the beginning, and like
yeah.
but you have an instinct. It will kind of cohere,
Yes.
in
Yeah,
yeah, phases.
absolutely. And it
Yeah.
and it f and you know that there is a hole, right? Like, I think that for me is the biggest challenge, the sort of the greatest stumbling block in the process of writing is this notion of the question of, is there really a hole here? Is there a totality, or am I just throwing things together and hoping that they cohere?
Mm.
Or am I writing this because it comes from some internal barometer of cohesion that I'm still processing and still looking for. And that to me, it feels like the most dangerous part of the process. This willing, like willing things that don't go together to go together because you really, really hope it's real. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
On that note, so I heard in a different interview that you did that there was at least a couple novels sort of in like since The Tiger's Wife that you've sort of attempted and then decided it actually doesn't cohere and they sort of didn't come together. And I was just curious about that. Like, diagnose that for me. What is the point at which you say it's just not going to work? I have to move on. Like, what is that kind of breaking point, if you will?
Um, I have learned at the time when I was writing those novels, which together amounted to many, many, many hundreds of pages. um, I didn't know that feeling yet. And the first one I finished, and it felt emotionally incoherent, and I didn't know why. Um, and I put it away with the assumption that I had put it away for good. Like I have never felt, and I think that this is then really a good you know barometer for that too. Just this feeling of not wanting to return to a project. If it's not calling you back, then gosh, it was good that you put it away. So that was something I learned from that first one, and that one was dystopian too. That one was sort of heavy dystopia, absolute chaos, end of the world stuff. um but from that novel, I pulled a character with whom I had the only emotional attachment, and I put him I put him in the Wild West. I really wanted to I was like, "I'm drawn to the West. I'm spending a lot of time in the West. There's something here. Let's do it." And I wrote 2 different drafts, of a novel about doctors in the American West, in Wyoming, actually, in the 60s. Very different drafts structurally. And the first one I wrote to sort of get a feel for the characters, and I was like, right, I feel good about these characters, but this isn't the right way to put them together at all. And then wrote it again. And that book was 600 pages. Uh, that book was 600 pages. And, but I couldn't, at the end of all of that, I still couldn't, the characters as the book progressed moved away from each other. And I couldn't find the right way to bring them back together. And I knew that there was, that they had to come back together for some reason. That something had to bring them back together, and I just couldn't find it. And that book I still think about all the time. That's a book I think that will has a chance to live on in some other form. But so for me, the feeling is one of, I can't solve this. And then it is a puzzle, right? I can't, like, I actually can't see the picture. There is a totality here. All the pieces have been handed back to me through, under the door. I'm putting my head under the door and asking anything else. And whoever had the puzzle is like, no, that's it. But I can't see it. And that feeling is one of disconnect. Whereas when it is working, there is a kind of there's a kind of glow. I'm making a kind of jazz hands motion with my hands. For those of you listening at home, there's a jazz hands situation going on at the periphery of my vision. There's a kind of glow that pushes the systems of the book closer together and you deeper into it. And absent that glow, it can't work for me. It just isn't working. So it is a feeling, and it's all very nebulous. But now I recognize it, I think.
Yeah. That is fascinating. That is really fascinating. What a great answer. I only asked that question to one other person that I can remember, which was Eric Larson, who wrote, the nonfiction writer, wrote Devil in the White City. And he had talked about, he gave up on some projects. And I asked him that question. And he said the main reason why he gave up on 2 of these books that he had gotten pretty far into, is they just didn't have any heart. And it's a very different answer than yours, but I think those are both wonderfully different answers.
Yeah, I love that too. Yeah, I love that.
All right. So weaving folklore into your stories is something that you are very much known for. It's something you do wonderfully. As somebody who's just published a book about a kind of folklore myth retelling, it's something that I love. I want to read something back to you that you said around the time of Tiger's Wife coming out. You said, pretty early on in the writing, I realized that myth making and storytelling are a way in which people deal with reality. They're a coping mechanism. In Balkan culture, there's almost a knowledge that reality will eventually become myth. In 10 or 20 years, you will be able to recount what happened today with more and more embellishments until you finally completely altered that reality and funneled it into the world of myth. So I love that. And I, as kind of a professional embellisher and myth teller myself, I totally feel seen. I love kind of shaving and sanding down my memories into like the perfect little, fable of life. But what really caught my eye about that quote was this idea that myths are a way of dealing with reality. And can you just talk about like the kind of, for lack of a better expression, psychological benefit? Or I mean, that's sort of what you're implying, is that there's some kind of like way that it's beneficial to render over time memory as myth.
Yeah, I think its primary benefit and also its primary downfall, or its primary danger, is this notion of cohesion. Taking something that is chaotic. Life is inherently chaotic. Events are random, right? You can't read meaning into everything that happens. And yet, I think as a species, we have a real impulse to do that. It is what has led us to myth make in all the ways that we have. And I think as individuals, we do it too. And then in some cultures, it's more prevalent than others. And I came from a very, very myth-making household in which in which I it always makes me think of that story, that Nabokov story, Symbols and Signs. Do you know it? It's about two parents, their elderly parents, of a young man who has been institutionalized for literally storytelling. Like, he's been institutionalized because he reads symbols and signs in everything, in the movement of clouds, in the way raindrops fall, and Nabokov takes this into an extreme of delusion. But then the story itself is actually relying on these same techniques to draw you into it, and to give you this unbelievable ending. It's up at the New Yorker, actually, in their
Hmm.
archive. You should read it immediately. It's amazing. It's very short. Um, I think, yeah, we storytell and myth make primarily as a mechanism to make sense of the chaos. And there's a real impulse to thread these random things together to create a coherent narrative out of our lives, out of coincidences that may have happened that turned out to be, benedictions in disguise.
Hmm.
All these things feel very natural in the progression of a life that is subject generally to chaos. And in my case, um, as is the case with Syl, there's the danger of it really is that you will create narratives out of things, out of coincidences, out of small pieces of information that actually have nothing to do with the answers you're seeking or the stories you're
Hmm.
telling. And for Syl, at her age, as was true of me at that same age, perhaps a little older, it turns into sort of a massive case of OCD. Um, Syl has of the belief that she can ritualize components of her life in order to create protections for herself and her mother. That she reads signs into things that may or may not be true, that an adult's mind might not actually connect, and it leads her into some dark places, and then it also leads her into realities that only she can see, and that are nevertheless the truth. So the coping mechanism sometimes creates greater issues, but that's the mind. That's the mind behind it.
Yeah, there's kind of there's an inevitable kind of irresistible impulse to myth make, and sometimes it works for good and sometimes it works for bad.
Yeah.
I think all of us kind of gotta thread the needle and figure out what are the good myths in our lives and what are the bad myths. um, so I want to, in a few minutes that we have left here, I want to talk about your teaching of creative writing. um, I always love to ask people who teach creative writing for a living or part of their living, some of their, I call it like the 5-minute MFA. Like the people in the audience like cannot sit in your class, but we can try to distill in the next 5 minutes everything you know about writing
I'm
as
here for
best we
that.
can.
Here I am.
Okay, so first, let me
It's
ask you.
perfect because everything I know about creative writing can be summed up in 5 minutes. So here I am for you.
So it works. Okay, so people say that writing can't be taught. Okay, now I my question to you is, what? Certainly, that's not true. But there are some things that can't be taught, and there are some things that can be taught. So, in your opinion, what are, like, give me some examples of those two things. Like, what is something when people say, "Oh, you can't really teach writing," like what are they? What is the thing that they're sort of referring to that can't be taught? And meanwhile, what are the things that students really benefit from when they try to learn their trade?
You can't teach an emotional connection to subject matter. You can't teach
Mm,
instinct. And instinct, I think, is fundamental to people being able to access the part of themselves that will produce great work. Um, you have to, this sounds so corny, but it's true. You have to let go,
mm,
and you have to let the things that are in the subconscious, you have to let the fish emerge, right? You do have to let it happen, and you can't mask it with great craftsmanship, with knowing how to write a perfect sentence, with being able to imitate um a writer you really admire. All those things, those are craft, and you need to know how to do them because you have to be able to manipulate this instinct you have to be able to manage the chaos into coherence of your own instinct. However,
Wait. But
sorry.
sorry, I didn't mean. Let me just kind of make sure I understand completely. You're saying you have to let go, but letting go is connected to having an emotional connection to the work. Why? If
Yes,
somebody has an emotional connection to something, what are they holding on to and not letting go of at that point?
they're holding on to the idea of craft, right?
Mm,
Like they're not actually letting themselves um, access the part of the work that has nothing to do with craft and learned ability. So I actually like to teach this in as a analogy of two doors, right? You have a house. The story is a house, and you may have heard this before, and I'm so sorry if you have. um, you have a house. The doors and windows are boarded up. You know there's something in there that's of value, that is extraordinary, that you have to find. You find ingress into the house. You find the door that works for you and you explore the house. You're in there for a really long time. You know every tile, you know every uh, chip in the stone, you know every room and all the upturned furniture in it. You know it by heart. It comes to mean something to you. That thing, that sincere connection to the house is the thing that can't be taught. Um, this idea of total vulnerability
mm.
and asking yourself, why am I moved by this? Why am I moved by the way, this dresser turned over? Why do I want to keep coming back here? That cannot be taught. The thing that can be taught then is how you find the door to invite somebody else in and let that person access the emotions that you've spent years cultivating in this space, right?
Mm.
Like I want to bring you into this house, reader, right? Um I recognize the door I came through is probably not valid for you, right? Um in the meantime, I've cleaned up some parts of the house, I've restored little bits of it. Now you're coming in, but I want you to feel what I feel in here. That can be taught. How to manipulate somebody else into those emotions, that's craft,
Mm.
I think.
Now, because I love expanding and connecting metaphors, earlier in the show, we've had so many metaphors on the show, but earlier in the show, we were talking about how the inner critic is like the shark in the ocean that kind of can destroy the work as we try to bring it into the world. You talked about the butterfly who's crushed in the process of bringing it into the world. In your house metaphor, where we're inviting somebody into this house that we love, add a destructive impulse that we were talking about being cautious of. Where would that fit into house metaphor?
The house is inherently changed by your presence in it.
Mm.
You are the you are the destructive force. Um, you have manipulated in your desire to bring somebody else in to share in this experience and to see the house. You have inherently changed it, right? There's
Mm.
something kind of zoological about all this. It's like you can't observe anything without actually changing it. But the act of your presence has fundamentally altered what the house is, its purpose. You've cleaned up. You think that's good, but the house might have been supposed to, maybe it was supposed to just sit there
Or maybe
as
the
what?
story was about how the house was so messy. And so now you got to
Yeah,
bring somebody in and be like, here is a kind of curated version of the messiness of this house, right? A
exactly,
presentable version of it. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That is fascinating. All right. A few other questions about you and teaching. What would you say? I mean, that was just a great one, but like, what's like one thing or another thing that is like you try to get across to your students that is particularly you, that may be something that like you don't hear other teachers like saying enough?
Oh my gosh. Oh, my I always say there are no wasted drafts, but like that other teachers say that all the time too. What is particularly me? Let me think about that a little bit more. I feel like um I feel like this goes back to the house too. I feel like I often I often ask my students at a certain point, why are you here? Not as in not why are you here in this MFA, but like why are you here in this project? Like tell me why you're writing this. Why are you drawn to this? And nobody asked me that growing up as a writer. And I feel it's something that isn't talked about enough. This idea that like if you are there to learn, you are there to learn only the things that can be talked about and nothing possibly psychological about yourself. And I get that, to some extent, that is not the remit of the creative writing teacher. The remit of the creative writing teacher is, I want you to think about this sentence and how it's working, and then how the next sentence works against it, and eliminate the problems between them. And now you have a cohesive thought, and we're going forward. But I think it's really important to ask yourself about your emotional and psychological state within a work. Um, the, even if afterwards, like whatever the book's life in public, the fact that it becomes a different artifact when it leaves your hands, those are things you can't control. And neither is your reason for wanting to write something. But I do think you have to know the answer to that. Why am I here? And that has reminded me of another thing I like to tell my students. Sometimes when you read a work, there's a plot hole. And and in that plot hole, the student will, in addressing that plot hole, the student will say, oh, I wanted to leave it ambiguous. And that's fine. I love to leave things ambiguous too. But the writer has to know the answer. The reader doesn't have to know the answer to whatever it is you want to leave ambiguous, but you, the writer, do, because it affects how it lands on the page and it affects how it lives in the work. You have to know the answer. You don't have to share it, but you have to know it.
And I heard you say that in another interview as well, that you can, as a reader, you can sense when the writer does not know the underlying facts of the world. It's almost, you can just smell it.
Yeah. Especially in early and sort of mid progress drafts where it's something that's like you just don't know the answer to this, and if you can find it, it's going to unlock all these other things.
And so what's your antidote to that? Like just go do some exploratory writing, kind of like do some world building exercises, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, for sure. Or do an exercise that Peter Carey used to do with our students when I was at Hunter, which is sort of it's just a free association exercise, but it's just writing what if for 10 to 15 minutes longhand, on scrap paper, and just being like, what if, I don't know why this character is avoiding this building. What if they killed someone in there? What if they saw someone murdered there? What if they know something about its foundations that other people don't? And then you just sort of like, you kind of let it go further and further and further away from plausibility, to the point of like, what if aliens once, what if it's a base for aliens? But somewhere in there is, if not the answer, the path to the answer. And so you do that kind of as many times as is necessary. And this is a problem that I face in short stories all the time, because I will get to the end. It is very rare that I will get to the end of a novel that's working and not know the ending. It is extremely common that I will get to the end of a short story that's working and not know the ending. And it can take years for me to find all the answers that are necessary to close out the story. I think I have like 12 stories sitting in drawers, maybe more, because I haven't reached that moment yet with them.
Yeah, and I feel like it's far more common for people to kind of like overwrite a novel by 100,000 words and then feel like they cut it back to a more reasonable length. But I don't know how much I hear about short stories being overwritten. Short stories that are like 2,500 words long being overwritten by like 30,000 words,
Yeah.
or something, right? Like, all right. So look, I want to ask one last question, and then I've got a bunch of questions from the audience, and we'll see if we can get to a few of them.
Amazing.
So writing these days seems far more like a political act than it has, than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It seems that books are received in a political way. Books are written with a political viewpoint. Books are pushed up the bestseller lists and pushed into critical esteem for their politics. Books are torpedoed and destroyed, not based on whatever else you might call the merits of the book, but on their politics. And it seems like almost like if you don't have something political to say in your fiction, you're sort of not doing it right. And even the absence of any kind of political agenda in your work itself can be interpreted as another political act. So all of which is to say, I'm just first of all curious, kind of, if you agree with that kind of climate, if you believe that we're living in a very politically charged climate for our fiction, but also I'm just curious with somebody with a bunch of students who are trying to kind of break into this world, if you feel like your students sense that, and if there's any advice that you give them if they're worried about that, or they feel like that's actually a real opportunity for them, and so on.
They're worried about that for sure, and they've been worried about that for a long time, I think. It's funny, um, it's funny how I think that there can be a cultural feeling about certain trends towards political writing, for instance, but it doesn't necessarily bear out in the numbers or what we see in the reality of what people are reading, what people are
Mm,
buying, what people are publishing. Um, I think it's a really difficult time in fiction right now for many, many reasons. Um, one of them being that people are not reading fiction enough, um, or at all. Like there's that we're competing now with free content, with um, all kinds of content. Like with social media, um, to a degree that is like there's no historical background for it. It's an ahistorical moment. It has no precedent. Um, but um, and so I think that we're trying to grab onto these notions of like, well, if I write something that hits, the correct way at the correct moment, it will be the book of this time, the book of this moment. And there is a search for that, and there is a real feeling among emerging writers that that is what they should be aiming for. But uh, it it has such a crushing weight um, on writers of all different backgrounds, and something that where I see it as being a particularly sorry a a place where I see it as being particularly insidious is in its application to writers from marginalized communities.
mm,
This idea that if you come from a marginalized community, if you're a person of color, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, you are meant to write about that. That like you're supposed to write, um, a daring expose of the travails of your community, and that you are not just meant to do that, but then to be the voice of your community.
mm,
That is an enormous amount of pressure to put on an emerging writer,
mm,
especially given that that pressure is being applied by, um, you know, largely white cis publishing forces. Um, and something that I think is very important for emerging writers to remember, if they can, is that sometimes by the mere fact of who you are in this world, you are a political entity,
mm,
and you don't have to make yourself more that. You can write the thing that moves you and let it stand for itself, and don't try to lean into these things that are being asked of you by forces that don't really have your writing or your best interest at heart.
wow.
And I think of a book that I find extremely successful in this endeavor is Tori Peters' Detransition Baby.
Mm,
It's an enormously successful, fantastic book that does not play into the things that publishers would necessarily ask of or look for in a book about um, trans issues, in big quotes, trans issues,
Mm.
and it's enormously successful because Tori Peters wrote a fantastic book that came from the soul,
Mm.
that came from the need to write that book. And I think yeah, so I think I do think that it's a difficult time, and I think it's important to remember how you're actually supposed to write, even though that remembering in itself can sometimes be a luxury, right? It's all
Yeah.
a snarl.
And if I can just sort of reduce what was just a beautiful, beautiful long answer, but
But
just
long, so long.
no, but richly so. But if I can like kind of reduce it slightly and connect it to what you said before, it just seems like what you're saying, Téa, across all these questions that I've asked you about teaching creative writing is the real gold, the real priceless gold is this strong, inexplicable, irresistible connection to the work. And like if that is the thing, oh my God, protect it with your life.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's get to a few audience questions before we run out of time here. Julie, she asked, who was your favorite character to develop in the Morningside, Téa?
Thank you for that question. I loved working on uh, I loved working on Syl, but I feel like I worked from within Syl. She's the protagonist and narrator, but I was extremely happy to discover the characters of Aunt Enna, who is her storytelling aunt, and the superintendent. I found such solace in Enna when I finally landed on what her character was actually like. And then I really loved developing May, Lewis Allen May, who is um, the friend that how do I how do I do this without spoilers? The friend that Syl makes, who becomes part of her quest at the beginning. I wrote his backstory because I needed to know who he was and where he came from and sort of the details of his life and how he'd gotten there to that particular moment and what it was he was actually looking for in the neighborhood. And then, as often happens in my work, I discovered that that was actually part of the book, that was a very, very important part of the book. So I love May a lot. Thank you.
All right, let's do a couple others. Renee, do you ever suggest that a student writes in a specific author's style before figuring out their own style of writing?
I do actually. I do all the time. I think it's a fun and useful exercise, and it also gets them to be explicitly in touch with what it is they're quietly doing, perhaps half aware and half not. Um, I think that uh, so often, and I honestly do it for myself too, because so often we're so deeply moved by the work of people we admire, that it feels impossible to get out from under their shadow, and then it also
Mm.
feels impossible to write things in a way that differs from what we think they would write. And so to kind of meet it head on and be very explicit about it and be like, I'm writing this in the style of Hemingway. We're doing it. Kind of gets it kind of gets the zoomies out. I don't know how to explain
That's
it.
so good.
So yeah, I think it's a great exercise.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, just meet it head on. Just honestly, this is what I'm doing. And then inevitably, right? It won't be that way. It will like
Right.
inevitably start becoming something more authentic.
Exactly. Because it makes you self-conscious about this thing.
Right.
It's like, oh, I actually could do this all the way and it would be
Mhm.
terrible. So let me pull away from that now that I've seen what it's like. You peer behind the curtain and you're like, oh no.
All right. Last question here from Robin. I feel like this is an appropriate place to land given the plethora of metaphors we've had on the show about writing. Have you ever had a student hit a brick wall in the house? This was asked during our kind of, metaphor of the house and leading the reader around the house. But have you ever had a student hit a brick wall, so to speak?
I sure have. And it's actually agonizing to see because and I've hit brick walls myself myself in the house. Um, it's really difficult to watch someone you've come to care about and want to succeed struggle deeply with their first encounter uh, with the impossibility of a project going forward. The good news is that it's usually an impossibility that is conditional. So it's it's like if you change things around, like we can break down this wall, or we can decide to not go in this part of the house. Like we have options here. It's just that the plan was one thing, and now it has become abundantly clear that it can no longer continue. And the heartbreak of that, especially when it happens to an emerging writer for the first time, is really visceral. And honestly, it doesn't get easier as you get further in your practice, except for that you can survive it. And that knowledge is really valuable. So it's excruciating but very important moment.
And you mean survive it and kind of fix any project, or it's kind of survive it as an artist generally, and you'll either fix this project or move on to another project, either one.
Survive it as an artist generally, and that you can, that something new will happen and you will be moving on in one way or another. But the acknowledgement of that and that feeling is significant.
Yep. Okay, so Téa, we got to get back to this book here. This is the book, folks, The Morningside by Téa Obreht. It's a wonderful book. I appreciate all the comments that I saw coming through and all the questions I didn't get to. Big fans out there and readers of this book, people kind of complimenting this book, asking questions about this book, so people are already getting through it and reading it. It's wonderful to see. Téa, the question I always end on is this. Imagine if you had an ideal reader for The Morningside, somebody who is just getting it in just the way in your wildest dreams you wished it would have been gotten. They're picking up everything you're putting down. And then just imagine that they finish the book, they sit there, they're looking out the window. In a phrase or even just a single word, describe what is the feeling that that reader will have.
Hope. Melancholy hope, bittersweet hope, something like that. That sounds a lot like resignation, but hope is yeah, I think so.
I love melancholy hope. I want like a tattoo that says melancholy hope on
I
it.
know it's supposed to be one word, but I think the melancholy really has to be there. Yeah, I think that's the feeling of the end of the book, and what I really hope people take from it, this sort of melancholy hope. Yeah.
Beautiful. What a beautiful sentiment. All right, folks. The book is called Morningside by the great Téa Obreht. Téa, thank you so much for being on the show. This was super delightful.
Thank you. This was just the best time. I'm so grateful to you all.
And thank you for joining us on your vacation. That was very special. We had a big crowd today. Thank you, everybody who was watching live, and we'll see you next week on Thoughtful Bro. Thanks again, Téa.
Thank you.